Hello and good evening. Welcome to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, we've just started a new year, but already there have been several alarming cases of child abuse. A 4-year-old boy in Johor who died due to serious injuries allegedly inflicted by his friends of his older sister under whose care he was placed. Then a 6-year-old disabled girl in Sarawak who was abused, killed and then stuffed in a sack before being thrown in the bushes. The mother's boyfriend, the alleged perpetrator. Recently, a man charged with raping and molesting his 4-year-old daughter, and a case of a 16-year-old girl raped by the police officer who was investigating her case after she reported being raped by her stepfather. Now, these alarming cases come on the back of news that the Women, Family and Community Development Ministry will soon establish a dedicated department or institution for children. Will this be enough to give our children the comprehensive protections that they deserve? Joining me now is Sharmila Sekran. She's the chairperson of the children's advocacy group, Voice of the Children. Sharmila, thank you for joining me on the show today. Now, those that I highlighted in my introduction, those are just a few of the many examples of abused children who have failed to receive help in time. Where do you see the current gaps in the approaches in addressing child abuse that can have avoided some of these cases?
I think there are two things. The first is we must have a heart to protect children. And I don't think there is sufficient understanding that children need protection and that it's our responsibility, society's responsibility, not just individuals like parents or teachers, but it's an all of society approach that children need protection. And the second thing is funding for the department that is tasked to protect children. So the protection of children comes in under the Child Act, which falls under the purview of the Ministry of Women, Family and Community Development. And specifically under JKM or the Welfare Department, the welfare officers are also child protectors, and they are tasked to specifically protect children. And when you don't have the right welfare officers, they're not sufficiently funded, they're under-resourced, they're doing 101 jobs. You have welfare officers who are not necessarily skilled in protecting children. Because that's not been their training, and then top it off with the fact that they're also running to protect or intervene in issues involving children in conflict with the law, single mothers, elderly care, all sorts of other people requiring some level of protection as well. And it's the same officer in some areas. Of course, children are going to fall by the wayside.
So, if this new department comes to be, one that is specific for children, do you see there being dedicated welfare officers, enforcement officers who are trained to deal with children, who are trained to, with the necessary skills?
Yeah, so I think not just having a department, but we also need to ensure that the social worker profession bill is passed in Parliament. That has been, 10 years already. I mean, we first talked about it in 2012, I think, or earlier, 2010, around that time, having professional social workers or professionalizing, that area of work, social work. We still have not seen it. We're still, at a bill stage or a draft stage. I understand that the bill is actually complete and ready for tabling in Parliament. But, we need it passed. We need an act, and we need to get the right people trained. We need the courses in universities to train people to be social workers. We need people trained specifically to do social work among children, which is very different from doing social work among, for example, people with disabilities or like I said earlier, single mothers or people living on the street. Specifically for children, and only then can we populate who are equipped to handle child protection within a children's department.
Well, okay, so you're saying that legislation is needed, is essentially the root of this. So we need this legislation on social workers. The Child Act is also quite, has been since 2001, if I'm not mistaken. Is the Child Act sufficient to provide the necessary protections for children?
A lot of civil society will say, well, there are two views to this, whether the Child Act is sufficient or not, or we need a new act. We have to remember that the Child Act is really an amalgamation of four different acts that existed prior to 2001. And the Child Act came about because of Malaysia's accession to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we needed to also include some aspects of that to ensure that we're in compliance with that convention, the CRC. But for the most part, the Child Act is sufficient. And one of the things that as a lawyer, I can say that Malaysia does very well is putting together good acts, good legislation. Sadly, it's the enforcement of the legislation which is desperately lacking in a lot of cases, and also in this case. So the Act does provide a lot of support in terms of ensuring the protection of children, identifying how, that children can be identified, protected. We have the Act which allows for child protectors to be appointed assistant child protectors from civil society or people equipped with the knowledge and ability to protect children who are not from within the ministry or the welfare department. But sadly, a lot of these assistant child protectors are not being called on, or they are not really activated in terms of ensuring that they're doing the work to protect children. So, there's a lot that can be done better in terms of child protection and in
So,
the child protection system.
sorry, Shamila, could you explain what does that mean that they're not being called on, they're not being activated? Meaning that there are the expertise and the resources, but we're not tapping them?
Yes, essentially that's what it is. Whether there are sufficient child protectors, assistant child protectors, we have to.
What is an assistant child protector?
So these are people who. So you have. The foremost child protection in the country will be the Minister of Women, because the Act comes in under that ministry. The foremost child protector will be the minister, but within the department, there are also child protectors who are appointed. And then, apart from within the ministry or within the government system, administration system of having child protectors, the minister can appoint outsiders who have the skill and the expertise to also be child protectors, so that if a child is at risk and there needs to be some level of intervention, if the person within the ministry is not able to go in because they're called elsewhere, you can actually call on these other people with expertise. But that's the question: do we have sufficient child protectors? Are sufficient child protectors appointed in the areas that we need them to move in? And are they being tapped? Are they being called on for service? So the bottom line is it's no for both.
Where else do you see there needs to be beefing up of resources, or I guess I'm wondering where in the system needs more strengthening? So you talked a little bit about the need for social workers, the need for having resources provided that are equipped and trained to deal with children. But where else can we strengthen our resources so that we're providing this comprehensive protection for children? It feels like it's only after the fact of an abuse that happens that we're taking some kind of action. But can more be done to prevent it?
Exactly. So, this is why we need people who are able to identify people at risk. So funding is really important as well. We are aware that a lot of the childcare centers have closed down now because of COVID. Post-COVID, a lot of childcare centers were not able to survive for the public. were not able to survive and therefore have had to close down. So there are a lot of children who perhaps are not going to registered childcare centers. They're not going or not going to childcare centers at all because there are no childcare centers near where the parents are, where the children live. And it doesn't make sense to do a 1 hour trek or 40-minute trek each day, each way, to put a child into a viable care center.
Mm.
Um,
Sh-
that they may not be fully trained.
Right. Yeah, that's also an area that requires monitoring. Sharmila, when you say identifying a child at risk, what does that mean? What is a child who is at risk, and how does the government, the system, protect it from any potential future abuse?
So, you gave the example earlier when you started, for example, the child who was violated by, or who was killed, right? The child with disabilities, who was killed by the mother's partner and stuffed in a bag. Um, so it does appear that perhaps the mother too was in a violent relationship, and was fearful of the man, right? The perpetrator. But at the first instance, it's important for family members, for neighbors to also raise the alarm if they know or think that someone is at risk. So it's not just about the woman who's at risk, it's also the entire family. When you have a situation, say, for example, of a one party in a relationship, and I'm talking about the adults within a
Mm,
relationship, in a violent relationship, automatically a child is violated because the child is within a violent setting, environment. So automatically the child is violated. It doesn't have to be that the child needs to be hit or violence perpetrated on the child before we raise the alarm. So we should already be raising the alarm when we know that a parent is at risk. So that's one example. Children of single parents are always, always more likely to be at risk, especially if they come from lower income groups. Children from what we know to be dysfunctional families, let's say, for example, where in the situation where the child in Johor was killed by the sister's friends, right?
mm,
Both parents were in prison. That child also, both parents in prison, one parent in prison, is the same as a single parent family. Again, the child is at risk. So, there are a lot of flags in so many of these cases where we know that even children with disabilities, even when you come from what may appear to be a functioning family or a middle class family, the mere fact that you have a child with disabilities immediately puts strain on the family, on the relationship, the family dynamics. You may have a situation where so much attention is placed on that child with disabilities that siblings or the other spouse may feel, that no attention is paid to them.
right.
They perpetrate violence against the child who's disabled.
So, Sharmila, then what then is the role of the state after identifying children who are at risk, families who are at risk? What would the state do with that information?
So again, there needs to be an assessment. And what I'm saying is very general. And just for the discussion, it's a lot more nuanced. But really, what you do is you identify the situation, and then there needs to be assessment. A home environment assessment needs to be conducted, whether the parents are able to cope in a situation where, for example, the child who is put in the care of the older sibling. Can the older sibling cope? How is the older sibling? What kind of support does that sibling have? And I'm talking not just about the financial, I'm also talking about the mental, psychological ability. So these kinds of assessments need to be made. And then we need to assess, well, who else can come in to support? So in a situation where, for example, there are other family members, what can we do to ensure or encourage that other family members are also getting involved in the care of children? Or in a situation where worst case scenario, we always want children to be with family, if not immediate family, then extended family. But worst case scenario, we need to remove the child from that unsafe environment until the child is safe to be put back in or to go back into, the environment is safe for the child to return to. So, but we're not doing this because we don't have the resources, we don't have the funding.
Wow.
The
Sharmila,
resource and funding.
Right. So the underlying issue is a lack of money, and more budget allocation should be allocated to protecting children. Shamila, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate your time. Shamila Sekran, the chairperson of Voice of the Children. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's continue our discussion about the alarming number of cases of child abuse that's been highlighted in the news recently. Now, on average, 17 children in Malaysia are abused daily, and this is based on reported cases. We know that child abuse cases are severely underreported. Now, every case of child abuse is a case of us failing a child. What can be done to prevent cases of child abuse from before they happen? Do we fail to pay attention to the red flags of children who are at risk of abuse? Joining me on the show now is Tanam Visvanathan-Suresh. She is president of the Johor Women's League, better known as Jewel. Tanam, thank you for joining me on the show today. Now, when we look at how look at the protections provided to children, particularly at-risk children, are they robust enough? What are the gaps in the kind of overall system that you think needs to be addressed?
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Melissa. Okay, the prevention mechanisms, honestly and seriously, they're just not robust enough. And that's coming from someone who does work on the ground. And definitely at the Johor level means we're looking at things at the state level. A lot more can be done. And I think we have to say the agencies are trying their best, but the interagency cooperation is sorely lacking. And a lot more can be done in terms of, one is creating awareness, which a lot of NGOs and a lot of other bodies also try and do. They go to schools and kampungs and at local, the urban areas, they try and do some awareness programs. But ultimately, I think a lot has to do with strengthening interagency cooperation. And there it's very, the gaps have, why I keep emphasizing the word is lacking, it's been, the same problem has persisted for years.
Okay. Tanam, if I may interrupt you very quickly, could you explain to me what the lack of interagency coordination means? Give me an example of how interagency coordination fails children.
Okay, so generally, when it comes to child protection or to discuss issues of child protection, several agencies will be involved. Typically, it will be the police, the welfare authorities, JKM, hospitals, and the judiciary, the legal component. Where sometimes I wish there would be stronger cooperation. I wish these agencies would train together and learn to speak the same language and be on the same page and fight together. Very often you'll find that gap, mainly because from what I see, perceptions of what amounts to abuse and neglect may differ from agency to agency. Perceptions. When the signs are not 100, there's a lack of a desire to take action when the signs are not obvious, even though the circumstances may show that abuse or neglect is about to happen. But when the signs are not clear, there's great reluctance. Perhaps it's because they're worried about they'll get sued. Perhaps they're worried about being missteps. Perhaps they are not sure whether the threshold of is this child really at risk or not has not been met, and several other reasons.
I see.
The other, sorry.
Yeah, please continue.
The other issue I also see is we would like the agencies to be more updated in their training. So, for instance, and there's a lack of uniform training. So, for instance, the police may or may not understand, because a lot of it will fall on the D11 unit. However, when there's not enough D11 officers around, other officers are assigned as IOs, investigating officers in child abuse cases. Now, they may not be fully trained on what how to handle child witnesses, how to elicit the information necessary. So sometimes, and this is a great source of frustration for NGOs, very often when these agencies mix up, there's a tendency to, okay, just give up and say, among the different parties, why don't you bincang this matter and try and settle it among yourselves? Why don't you do a bit of rundingan? Why don't you promise each other that you won't do this again? You call it aku janji. Now, this is fairly controversial to talk about. However, it's a phenomenon that's persisted for a long time. So anyone who says they've never heard of it is actually, a lot of people have heard of this.
Right. Well, clearly there are systemic issues within the way the overall system provides protection. There seems to be working in silos. The Women, Family and Community Development Ministry has recently said they're going to establish this dedicated department for children. Then, what do you think this department should do in terms of its scope and its powers? And as you brought up, the need for interagency cooperation. What would you like to see this department take charge of?
I think they have to recognize that the reason why there's a big push for this department, I feel, is because of the range of issues that come under child rights and child safety. That includes whether it's the abuse and neglect, but also young offenders, children in conflict with the law, a lot of issues. So that is why this great push for a dedicated department. What I would like to see is, as I said, real proper implementation. I think there's a lot of focus on the laws needing to be amended and changed. And I think it's very important that SOPs are reviewed every 5 years. I think the laws should be reviewed every decade or so. However, I think the failure is always in the implementation. And that's, as I said, that may be because of the lack of training, the lack of updated knowledge. It's not just the police. Just now, shouldn't be so unfair to the police. It's also JKM officers. When they are assigned as child protectors or child protection officers, is that the job that they actually do when it comes to the ground? Because when it comes to floods, the child protectors also double up as flood relief workers. They also do a whole range of other stuff. When it comes to hospitals, do they recognize symptoms of child abuse? And is this understanding of these signs uniform, even when the child doesn't say that there's neglect and abuse happening? So I'd like updated training, but really it's all implementation. So having a dedicated department may therefore focus energy and resources towards better implementation and a better system of child protection.
Well, can I ask you then about the role of the society at large? I mean, yes, I agree the system needs overhauling, particularly in terms of training. But as adults, I mean, all adults hold some form of responsibility anytime a child falls through the cracks. In terms of the role of society, neighbors, teachers, and I know as Jewel does a lot of grassroots work on this. Where do we need to step up in that regard?
Okay, number one, I would like to see teachers being made mandatory reporters of abuse. Right now, for some reason, they are not, but many cases of abuse are reported through the teachers or at school. They're recognized at school. However, for now, because they're not mandatory reporters of abuse, the role of the teacher is just to inform the family that this child has reported abuse. Now, that can be very complicated because, of course, the child is not able to stand up for itself. Adults negotiate among themselves about how to sidestep abuse. So when it comes to the question of what can society do, number one, be equipped with understanding and knowledge. Number two, don't get too caught up in if I get involved, I'll get sued. Because there's actually elements in the law that tells you that if you don't report, it's a crime to recognize a child abuse case and not report it. So I think a lot of there's also a lot of misunderstanding and misperception on the part of the public as to what their role is. To what extent should they push this reporting matter? I would like to see better sex education in schools. I think in Singapore, the first week of the first year of Standard 1, they are already taught about good touch, bad touch. I don't see why that cannot be done here. And I think children only benefit and will make better decisions if they're told in advance. This idea that children get corrupted if they're exposed to early education, sex education, is actually wrong, misperception.
Thanam, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I want to thank you for being on the show. Thanam Visvanathan-Suresh there from Johor Women's League, or better known as Jewel. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.